lecturing you. We're going to have, hopefully, broad participation. And we'll have a debate on some of these more gray areas on some solutions. So one of them is a case of justice. That's what just war theory is. So in order to know what just war is, you have to have some sort of definition of justice, right? Or when is it applicable? Or so if you talk about slavery, and to what extent is sacrifice required to bring about justice? I'll think about that for a second, but we'll try to come to an answer at the end of the discussion. This is just kind of gathering some thoughts, running through your head, and then we'll have some discussion. So in just war theory is originally from St. Thomas Aquinas and a bunch of other Catholic scholars from the School of Salamanca. And I would like to think that just war theory is the application of the non-aggression principle applied to foreign policy. It's not a perfect analogy, but that's pretty close. Basically, if someone is invading your person or your property, you have the right to defend yourself. If you see someone attacking someone else, you have the right to defend that person. Those two situations are just, but the act of committing, aggression or coercion under most other circumstances wouldn't be just. So just war theory in most regards seems pretty libertarian on the surface. So I in trying to answer the question of is there ever a just war? And in a free society, maybe even a state society, how would things like, what kind of criteria would there be for conduct in or engaging in war? And the other source of, so I was looking towards libertarian writings, literature on this, and also, the traditional literature, the Catholic literature on just war. And also, because I'm Buddhist, I wanted to see what Buddhism has to say about just war theory. And not too surprisingly, it was fairly consistent in all three of those, said about the same thing. There were some situations where, for example, in World War II, Buddhism became a vehicle for the state to, as a method of, for rampant jingoism to say that we need, as nationalism, and the samurai culture and the Buddhism were so overlapped that it became perverted as a tool for the state. But that's an example. That's a rare exception, I should say. Normally, Buddhism talks about it's okay to defend yourself or from an attacker and whatnot, and basically it's the same thing. So the other thing that I think is interesting, that may be a little bit different from the other ideas, is that Buddhism talks about how, as a prerequisite to engaging in violence or war of some sort, that you need to love your enemy, which might sound really impossible or difficult. And in fact, some people argue that you shouldn't engage in war if you are incapable of that, because then you will resort to being no better than they are. And so how would you love your enemy? You would do it by realizing that they are human as well, but they are just overcome with ignorance. And I think that's really important as for our message of liberty, is that we need to realize that people, whether they are government employees or whatever position they have or stance in or relationship with the government, that most of the time they are are just ignorant of the role. And if we can bring a better message, we can try to convince them. And hopefully violence will always be used as a last resort. And that's one of the criteria for just war theory. So I'm going to read over some of the ideas of just war theory, and then I'll stop and ask what your thoughts are on that particular clause in just war theory. And let's also, because of humanitarian aid, foreign intervention in Syria is a big thing. Let's use this as a chance to see, is there ever, in history, especially right now, a situation where just war could be waged? And does Syria meet that criteria? All right, so the first criteria for just war, it must have a just cause. And the reason for going to war needs to be just and cannot be solely for recapturing things taken or punishing people who have done wrong. And innocent life must be in imminent danger. And the purpose for going to war must be to protect life. So basically, if you're defending someone else, you're basically just trying to stop a genocide. Does that seem like a fair interpretation? So it said it can't be to reclaim property, recapturing things taken, or punishing people. So, for example, Hitler's invasion of the Rhineland into Poland to reclaim Poland wouldn't even meet just war criteria here. Can you guys think of a historical example where reclaiming property that used to be owned previously, or do you agree with this statement that basically the only reason to begin with to qualify as a just cause is that it's to maximize human life? Yes.
So if someone steals something from me, I'm not justified in force against them to take it back.
We're talking about war. We're not talking about individual one-on-one.
Mm.
So invasion of land. Yeah, that we'll get into what qualifies as a group thing of a war. That's the next one. But would you guys agree that if someone invades, let's say if Russia invaded Alaska or something, but they didn't harm the Alaskan people, would we be justified in counter invading? Surely that would be the response of the U.S. government, no doubt about it. But
I'm just trying to think of the distinction between, in other words, they invaded Alaska, that they were imposing their own government on the people. I think in terms of the people there.
right.
So it's not, to me, that's not property. That would be oppressing the people there, imposing.
But what if they were? I mean, we know Russia isn't the bastion of liberty, but
Except now it is.
Yeah, well,
unless you're gay, but
That's right.
yeah. But imagine if otherwise they were no more oppressive or less oppressive than the current regime, but it was just a matter of tax revenue, and maybe the people didn't necessarily, maybe because they identified with being United States citizens and they spoke English instead of Russian, maybe they didn't necessarily want to be conquered, but at the same time, it's more like you're annexed, but we're not gonna make you pay too much tribute or something.
Well, there are lots of cases in history of, an area that for some reason is part of one state, and then basically the people in that area invite the neighboring state, maybe they have ethnic ties, religious ties, or whatever, maybe their ancestors came from over there, and they essentially invite them to invade so they can be reunited with what they consider to be the motherland.
Soviet Georgia.
Yeah.
So in this situation, I know it's always going to be very complicated, but would you think that it's okay to defend from, well, in this situation, you're talking about situations where the local inhabitants are inviting,
Some of them.
yeah, some of us would be invasion. Here's a one that just came to mind. What about, was it the Falkland Islands under Thatcher, Margaret Thatcher? Right, so they were part of Argentina or something?
Yeah.
Well, Argentina claimed.
Yeah, and Argentina claimed it as their territory, their British colony. And for the most part, I think the people on the islands wanted to remain British, right? So, as long as the people's lives weren't being threatened, maybe that wouldn't even meet the criteria of just war. Which is interesting. I don't know, like, according to the way this is written, we can agree, we can disagree with this.
If one or two states are involved, there's almost no way that somebody's life isn't a threat.
Right.
Because
Yes.
people are going to.
Yeah.
There, I have almost nothing to say about what you've said so far, except I was just wondering if in reading you also came across, you might have been at your panel yesterday, so you know Brian Kaplan is
Mhm.
a professor at GNU who sort of leans, well not leans, but he's like fairly explicitly anarcho-capitalist, and he has all these blogs. And for some reason, someone this week sent to me or somehow I saw it, he had this piece on what a real libertarian foreign policy should be like, and it was on, I thought it was funny in a way because it was on that blog that's like Economics of Liberty or it's supposedly more an encyclopedia of economics, but he has like a column there and he writes whatever he wants. So he had this little article, it's only one page long, that said real libertarian foreign policy isn't non-interventionism or isolationism or any of the words that people use, it's pacifism. And then he goes on to defend that, and it's clear he doesn't mean pacifist in the sense of you can't retaliate, or that you can't even do things out of revenge. And I read it so quickly, I'd have to go right back and reread it, but I think what he's essentially saying is it's pacifist in the sense that we don't want the state to do anything. Like, you might do things in some other way.
Right.
And then I have a big qualification of that, which is if nobody will let you have any other means of defense, then clearly I think you maybe do sometimes want the state to do something, although you know it will always screw it up and it will always overdo it. It will like occupy instead of retaliate. But like, if the only way you had to defend yourself against someone who actually was trying to kill you was to use the state, then I would actually use the state, knowing that they would fuck it up and actually occupy Iraq for 10 years as opposed to just kill the people who blew up the World Trade Center, or whatever the issue is. Which is I think everybody should read this little Brian Kaplan thing. And I should go ahead and I should go read it. I started to copy it.
Did you post it on Facebook? Someone did.
I might have. It may have been floating around.
I haven't seen it yet. I'll check it out.
It's actually from I think a couple years ago, but it's I mean it is deliberately supposed to be provocative because basically even in the title it says the real libertarian foreign policy isn't non-interventionism, it's pacifism.
Mm-hmm.
Then you read it, and of course he doesn't mean pacifism exactly in the sense of like we're all supposed to walk around and let muggers beat us up, and I mean he doesn't, you know.
Or Gandhi, the Jews should commit mass suicide as a way of protesting Hitler.
Right. No, he doesn't mean that. Or that, like, yeah, that the Jews should have done, unfortunately, what I think in some cases they maybe did do, which was to quietly get into the trains. Kind of thing.
Right, I mean, if you believe the state is illegitimate, then the idea of just war becomes more complicated because, you know, it's never just what they do.
Right.
Well, except for, like, if the only person I have to protect people in my household against rape and murder are, in fact, the police,
Right.
even though the police do all kinds of things that
Right.
are wrong, clearly I'm going to call the police, so.
We've had
We've had this
this
discussion,
debate
yeah.
so much.
Do you disagree about whether you pick
I'm
up or down line on
I'm
one?
more on your side that like
Maybe you do down line
if
on
I
one
see a
sometimes.
mugger,
And Steve doesn't, I know where he lives, I'm not.
if I see a mugger and the only, and you know, I'm unarmed and I don't have any
Steve, do not
recourse.
buy a big screen TV, because I don't have a flat screen yet.
If a country were invading America, I would hope that the U.S. government would finally use its military in a just way.
You would hope that it would be a time when we were protected by more than the oceans, which is what may have actually been primarily protecting us all this time.
Right. And even though, I don't think it's too much of a contradiction to say I disagree with foreign policy. In fact, I want the DoD scrapped. And at the same time say, but since we don't have that choice right now, you know, if we're being invaded, you know, then
Right.
it should do its job kind of thing.
Not really related, but just in the past week, I mean, discussions actually came up about the Navy Yard shooter, and somebody actually did say, well, we can't hire enough security on bases anymore because of sequestration.
Right.
To which, you know, the immediate thought is, you have how many hundred military bases
Security
around the
on military
world?
bases.
So like, maybe if you closed 12 of them somewhere, then you would have the money to,
Yeah. I used to work on the Navy Yard too, so.
Well, the irony is that they've spent a lot of money training everybody in the Navy.
and they won't let them have
And you disarm
guns.
them.
Oh yeah, that's even a more major problem,
Yeah.
but the people
Then
who
you
were
have to
claiming,
hire
the
private
people who were
military
literally
security.
claiming, we don't have enough guards because of sequestration.
I mean, these kind of policies have, when I was in the Guard, my Guard unit, I didn't go deployed to New Orleans after Katrina. And the Maryland Guard sent them unarmed, and they housed them at the convention center.
Because they weren't allowed to have arms?
They just didn't think they needed them, I guess, or they didn't want to, the cost, I don't know what the reason was, but the Army Command there, it was a very disorganized operation, as you might imagine, wouldn't let anybody into the city unarmed at that time. So they were sitting at the convention center.
So they weren't allowed in the city because they didn't have arms.
Right.
And Maryland didn't
They
give
went
them
to New
arms.
Orleans and then came.
So they were another mouth to feed instead of being help.
Right.
Is the story.
And,
the
and also,
military is very-
if there had been a crazy person around, a group of disarmed people, but.
In general, there's a lot of bureaucracy associated with assigning a weapon to somebody who's been trained to use it. I think for obvious reasons.
So here's the next, let's move on to the next pillar
There's iron.
of, no, that's okay, of just war. And this one I think is also controversial. It's an idea of comparative justice, and it goes back to kind of an idea of, is there a greater good when you're executing justice? And I'll channel Buddhism, which often talks about karma and justice, and so if you do good things will happen to you. Now, some people believe in that as cosmic justice, and so that you'll get your comeuppance, right? But I'm not so inclined to think that way. I think that it's more of we need to enforce our own justice, and it's more karmic justice is more about the relationships and your effect on other people will eventually, more likely than not, come back to you. So if you're nice to the people around you, people will be more inclined to do good things, return good favors to you. It's not some sort of cosmic justice, but relating that to foreign policy, if you have to do bad things in order to do good things, is it right to do it? So comparative justice says, while there may be rights and wrongs on all sides of conflict, to overcome the presumption against the use of force, the injustice suffered by one party must significantly outweigh that suffered by the other. So, obviously, if we go bomb Syria, if the U.S. government bombs Syria, I should say, we're not going to go do that, then innocent people will be harmed, right? So can you justify doing any sort of violence towards your intended target if there's a strong probability that innocent people will be harmed? Is that ever justified? And if not, then that is a very high hurdle to doing any sort of military action ever, right? If the odds are that you are going to harm an innocent person in the process. What do you guys think?
I usually get excommunicated from libertarian groups at this point, because on that is kind of hypothetical, because I'm sort of ranting about it, and I think if you're actually about to be killed, that there are very few limits on what you get to do to take out the person about to kill you. And if they've somehow situated themselves and you're an innocent person, they're actually responsible for their death. not you.
I would say in direct self-defense, I would pretty much agree. There's gonna be, of course, gray areas and stuff, but.
You don't have to be gleeful about it, but
Right.
you don't have to enjoy taking out the
But
rifle.
how about
that's
this, how about Syria, where it's not so cut and dry?
Oh, yeah.
You know?
Well, if you were, first, one calculation would be, if you attack, how many people would die, how many innocent people, compared to if you don't attack? And is there a bias toward non-action? In other words, there's actually isn't there, and somebody, correct me if I tell the story wrong, but isn't there a psychological experiment where they ask people, if you have a train running down the track and it goes this way and it's going to kill 5 people, and it's going to go that way and it's going to kill 1 person, and people have a different response if they have to actually take action by pulling the switch to make it go and kill the 1 person instead of 5. They're less likely to do that than they are to just let it happen if that's the other way. In other words, if by doing nothing, that's right. So in the case of something like, should there be a bias toward non-action, even when the calculation is that more people would be saved by taking action than would be killed by not taking action? Which, by the way, I'm not saying that's the case in
Right.
Syria, because I don't think that's the case. But hypothetically, that would be the argument, or at least that would be the argument somebody would make for.
Which is an interesting case when you set it up that way, because it actually is, there are actually three possibilities the way you're setting it up. There's not doing anything, and then you don't know whether the train's going to kill the 5 or the 1. Or once you find out whether it's going to kill the 5 or the 1, you take a specific action. Well, maybe do you already know? You already know whether it's going to kill the 5 or the 1.
The bias is, people will just stand by and do nothing, even, or they're more likely to do that, even if it's going to kill 5
Oh, because it's going to kill 5, and so their action is to make it only kill the 1.
Yeah, and so the action would be to make it kill the 1, or in the opposite situation, then, in other words, they're biased toward not doing, whichever side is not doing anything gets a certain number of votes.
But going to war, what you're really doing is more like, it's going to kill the 1, and the 1 is either you or someone who's a friend or relative, unless you take an action to make
Right.
it kill the 5 who are way across the world and you don't know them.
Right.
Think
But this
about
is,
Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, obviously, I think in hindsight, I don't think that killing, 400,000 or whatever civilians,
Something
I don't think that saved the equivalent of the same amount of Americans' lives in the long run. Some people have tried to make that argument, that it saved lives in the long run by ending the war sooner, but the fact that the war was already coming to an end and stuff. But ignores some of the finer details. Use this as an example,
But that's kind of the argument they're making about Syria too, or trying to make, which is that it is actually self-defense of actual people in the United States, because we must have this international regime in which it's really, really bad and no one can ever use chemical or biological weapons, and we can't ever let anybody use them, even though we let people use them every other time, because we have to take out anybody who's been using chemical weapons to maintain this international regime, which is kind of international law, and the purpose of that is in fact to protect actual Americans from living in a world in which people use weapons of mass destruction like chemical and biological weapons.
if I'm not mistaken, it was Britain that sold the chemical weapons to Syria. So.
Well, in any event, Syria used chemical weapons probably in 2004, and obviously maybe 6 months ago, and a year ago, and so on, they were using them, chemical weapons, and of course, Iraq used chemical weapons against the Kurds. Nobody disputes that.
And also could Assad use the argument that we used in Nagasaki and say, oh, well, I have to do these horrible things to end the civil war now, because if it continues to rage, even more people will be killed.
Mm-hmm. And this reminds me of my last talk was about libertarian cosmopolitanism, which argued that we should view all people of having, if rights apply to people, they should apply equally to everyone. And so how that applies to this is that if we're talking about using a cost-benefit analysis as a calculus of how to weigh our actions, then we should consider, especially the innocent lives lost of another nationality to be equal as American lives lost, as long as they're both innocent, so to speak. And so it's not a fair thing to say that, well, 200,000 or 400,000 Japanese killed is worth saving 100,000 American lives, or even an equal amount, right? If you say, well, they're both humans, so that's really what we should care about.
The assumption in this question and all the questions is that you have perfect knowledge.
Right.
One of those 5 people might come up with something.
Well,
And I think that biases us towards inaction because, and in the case of war, the knowledge is not just imperfect, it's the opposite of perfect.
The fog of war, yeah.
And I mean, you were talking about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that, you know, the projection was that it was going to cost 1 million American lives and 2 million other people dying, most of them innocent people and so forth. And so regardless of whether we can look back now and say that's not what would have happened, you know, the people who made that decision at the time were basing it on at least, you know.
Yeah, but the problem with that is that, you know, it's, you can't, no one gets an excuse for their intentions, in my opinion. You know, you don't choose to kill someone and then later on say, oh, well, I didn't have, you know, it's like Bush, well, we were lied, you know, I was lied to. No, you know, it's like, it's your responsibility. You're talking about killing people, you know, and, you know, we could judge children for their intentions and be like, oh, you know, you know, because no one cared for children, what happens. But adults, it's like, it's just, you know what I mean? Like, I just, you know, sorry, you're responsible for that. You may, like Gavin was saying, you should know that you don't have enough information, you know?
Well, and
It's your responsibility.
In the case of Japan in World War II, though, the information is not that people, I mean, people knew they didn't have the information because it was unknowable, in other words, you're making a prediction. But on the other hand, you do have the fact that people were rationalizing because they wanted to do it.
Yes, yeah.
Because they wanted the war to be over, and heck, they wanted to punish the, you know, the term they would say at the time was the Japs. You know, they wanted to punish them, and they didn't see, particularly because of the cultural differences, that was part of it, part of the fact that, you know, part of it was Pearl Harbor, part of it was cultural differences. They didn't see Japanese people as fully human in that regard. So the calculation they made then to justify what they were doing was then biased by the fact that they were really just looking for a justification. So you could make that point as well. So it ties into what you said.
So this next one, I think, might get a laugh from us. The third criteria is competent authority. The action of war must be waged by a competent authority that is representative of the people it's acting on behalf. It must be a public authority. So dictators don't count because they're not truly representative of their people and stuff like that, right? So we would argue possibly that even under the best scenario, you know, of a democratically elected government or whatever, that still they wouldn't meet the qualities of a competent authority who represents us. Now, sometimes though, that, for example, Iraq War was incredibly popular at the beginning. You know? So you could say the government was giving people what they wanted, misinformed as they were. But what do you guys think? Do you think that this to me is kind of like Brian Kaplan's post, right? This is the antithesis of Brian Kaplan's post, saying that there basically is no competent authority, and that in an anarcho-capitalist society where ideals, no one would meet that criteria or should meet that criteria.
I can't remember all the details of this post because I just read it like 5 days ago. So, that makes me think two things, and one is kind of uncharitable because I don't actually remember any details of Thomas Aquinas' biography, if I know any. But a part of it makes me think, I mean, the criticism now that people who conduct wars are only rarely, and it's becoming actually ever served in the military. Like Hillary and Obama were never even in the military. I think they're our first big candidates who don't even have. It was in the last presidential debates. It was kind of noticeable that that's a question that's always asked is about your military service, and it's no longer a question that's